Hello there. I've been looking at some wines that are good typical varietal examples of the grape that they're made from, and a wine that we've just tasted is the 2022 Estate Riesling Trocken from Weingut Wittmann. And I picked this out because Wittmann are a highly respected producer from Westhofen in the Rheinhessen, and I find that their wines are quite representative both of the variety and of the place. Now, the Wittmanns trace their history as winemakers in this region back to 1663, when evidently there are legal documents showing them leasing vineyard land in a place called Seehof. So they describe their winemaking heritage as being of 15 generations, and they say the family has more than 350 vintages in this area. Probably quite revolutionary. In 1921 they first started bottling their own wines, and it was in the 1960s that the grandparents of the current owner, Philip, they would have been Georg and Irmgard Wittmann, moved their farm to concentrating on viticulture. Now, it was in the 1980s, and starting from 1988, that Philip's parents, Gunther and Elizabeth, moved their viticulture to being entirely organic. Initially they were certified by Ecovan, but then in 1990 they've moved to become members of the Naturland Association of Organic Farmers. Now, as I say, the current winemaker is Philipp Wittmann. He is a graduate of Geisenheim University. He today runs the 28-hectare estate along with his wife Eva Kluserath, and the pair run another estate that belongs to Eva's family in the Moselle Valley. Evidently, after graduating, Philip felt the need to travel before returning to Westhofen. So he lists having worked in Bordeaux, in Burgundy, in Tuscany, and travelling in the United States and in Australia before deciding to return home to work in the family business. And I think this travel led Philip to want to be innovative, and yet at the same time his experience working here has led him to come to respect the long winemaking traditions that his family have here. It was in 1998 that the estate joined the VDP. You can see that from the eagle motif on the top there, so Germany's Association of Quality Winemakers. Then in 2004, Philip decided that the already organic estate should pursue biodynamics. Philip's toying with innovation saw him conducting increasingly large amounts of fermentation in stainless steel and using cultured yeasts, but he came to feel that the wines lacked character. So although they do still use stainless steel tanks for fermentation occasionally, they've returned to doing much more in the way of fermentation in large old oak casks, and their fermentations are entirely spontaneous with the natural yeasts. The soils here in Westhofen are particularly rich in limestone, so the topsoils tend to be sort of limestone marls, and under that the bedrock tends to be water-retaining limestone. 65% of the estate's vineyards are Riesling, and that's the variety they famously cultivate on their top vineyard, Morstein, which is one of 4 Grosse Lager that they have. Morstein is a Grosses Gewächs. Work in the vineyards is done by hand, and low intervention approaches are used in the winery. They start by using very gentle presses designed to mimic the effect of an old basket press, to give clean juice to avoid the bitterness that comes from a harsh pressing. The juice is run primarily into large old oak casks, although a little of it might go into stainless steel, and fermentation is done entirely with the indigenous yeasts that have found their way into the winery on the fruit. Fermentations are described as traditional, so I'm assuming there's not too much cooling, that sort of thing. Anyway, let's have a look at the wine, shall we? It's a lovely colour. There's a medium yellow there. It's not particularly lemony, more sort of a straw sort of colour. Swirling it, the wine has 12% alcohol according to its label, and it's a Trocken wine, so it should be a dry wine. So we haven't got sugar, we haven't got particularly high alcohols there to give it viscosity. This appears to be a relatively light-bodied wine. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? The aromas seem unmistakably Riesling. There are waxy notes, there are limey notes, there are petrol notes, perhaps a touch of apple, some floral top notes. There's a pretty good, certainly a medium intensity on those aromas, and they're nicely defined. There is a whiff of a sort of a toasty minerality, that gunflint sort of note. Can be a pointer for indigenous ferments. It just adds a nice bit of complexity. And there do seem to be slight honeyed notes, or perhaps those are honeysuckle notes. That sort of complexing aroma. So let's taste. On the palate, the wine's completely dry. It's quite tart and crisp. There's quite a mineral nature to the acidity. It really is mouth-watering. And while there are notes of lime, there's actually sort of an appliness as well. The freshness is giving good length. There's a little bit of warmth at the back palate. I'm not thinking that the 12% alcohol is doing that, but actually I think that sort of rich fruit, those sort of slight honeysuckle notes I was getting on the nose, giving a little bit of sort of slightly waxy textured weight to the back palate. And what I'm describing as waxiness perhaps has hints of paraffin, delicate precursors to a more sort of petrol-y note that's likely to develop in the wine with time. The wine's acidity and freshness would, I think, enable it to age. If you wanted to keep it for 4 or 5 years, I don't think that would be a problem. I would say the fruit has reasonable concentration, but this is at best medium-bodied, so I think it's probably best drunk up relatively young, while its crispness is still balanced by those lovely floral notes and the fresh limey fruit. The wine's mouth-watering nature is persisting. It's giving it a long, elegant finish. It's quite straightforward. Not a lot of flavour development, but there is a good intensity of that sort of waxy lime note, and there are still those toasty gunflint hints above that. So yes, I looked at the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this vintage of this wine, and it gets an 89 out of 100. And I think that's about spot on, actually. This is a good example of a well-made varietal wine, but I wouldn't say it had any particularly identifying individualistic characteristics that would make it stand out. And I don't think it's a wine for long-term aging. So I think 89 out of 100 is about the right score for this wine. And it's worth remembering this is not a particularly expensive wine. So you can check that. I'll leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see where it's available and at what price, and then you can use the tabs on that page to get lots of other information about where it comes from, the producer, the grape variety, its pricing. You can compare vintages and look at critics and users' reviews as well there. So hopefully that's of great use to you. Thank you so much for joining us for this tasting. It's great to have you here. If you would like to watch more of these tastings, do please sign up and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and that way you can set yourself an alert and be notified every time we publish a new tasting. If you've enjoyed the tasting, do please press the like button. That would be fantastic. And if you think you have friends who might like to watch it as well, do feel free to pass it on to them. We'd really appreciate that. If you have any comments you'd like to leave, please pop them in the comments box below. We would love to hear and to be able to respond to your views about the wines we're looking at, the tastings we're doing, or anything else that relates to that. So thank you again for joining us, and I do hope you'll manage to make some time. Come and join us for another video tasting in the very near future. Until then, bye for now.